All right, let's get started. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sébastien Pérouse. I'm a research professor working with the Central Asia program at George Washington University. I am very, very happy to welcome all of you to the seminars of the Institute for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies at George Washington University. This seminar is also part of our initiative we recently launched on civil society in Central Asia. Turkmenistan remains the most authoritarian state in the former Soviet space. President Gurbanguly Berdimuhamedov has ensured that no one can emerge as a threat to his hold on power. The country has de facto a one-party political system, no independent judiciary, no freedom of media, and it consistently ranks at the bottom of human rights rankings by international groups. Civil society in Turkmenistan remains unable to organize. Individuals, even those not involved in politics, have been harassed and have been even arbitrarily arrested. Turkmen citizens have grown up largely isolated from the outside world and in a system with poor education, few career opportunities, and a cultural sphere which is dominated to a large degree by the works of the president. Turkmenistan has been also increasingly impacted by a combination of the economic crisis that the country has been going through since the fall in hydrocarbon prices that began in 2014 and the consequences of the COVID-19 crisis. And I should add here that Berdimuhamedov and the government of Turkmenistan have systematically denied the presence of the COVID-19 virus on the Turkmen territory. The Turkmenistani population now is facing a very serious social and human security crisis, including food insecurity. And this very difficult economic and social situation is significantly worsened by the predatory, by the kleptocratic nature of the regime, by the appropriation by the ruling elites, in particular by the president's family, of part of the country's economic profits. And this is exactly what we are going to address today. This seminar is based on the presentation of a report entitled Turkmenistan, a Model Kleptocracy. So this report is published by the NGO Crude Accountability and is authored by Tom Mayne. And I'm very, very grateful to have Tom with us today. And this report is exceptional for the breadth of research which is carried out by its author. It explores in depth a difficult topic on which little has been published. So Tom is a research fellow at the University of Exeter. He's currently working on a project regarding money laundering by Central Asian elites into UK real estate. For 12 years, Tom was responsible for Eurasian investigation at Global Witness, which is an anti-corruption NGO, and which has produced a series of reports about corruption in Central Asia and the enabling of that corruption by financial service providers in the West. The presentation of the report will be followed by comments from three eminent specialists on kleptocracy or on Turkmenistan or on both. So we'll have today Michel, Alex Cooley, and Bayram Shikhmuradov. I will introduce them just before they take the floor. Then we will have a Q&A session. So please feel free to send your questions in the chat box. And before giving the floor to Tom, Kate Waters will make some introductory remarks. So thank you, Kate, for being with us today. Kate is a co-founder and executive director of Crude Accountability, which is an environmental and human rights nonprofit working with communities and activists impacted by oil and gas development. She has worked with human rights and environmental defenders in Central Asia, the Caucasus, and Russia since early 1990s. Kate has lived and traveled extensively throughout the region, and she's the author of many reports and articles on civil society in Central Asia and the Caspian region, and she has been interviewed for print media, radio, and television about the environment, oil and gas, and human rights in the region. So, Kate, thank you very much for being with us today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sebastian. We are really excited to be hosting this event together with the Institute for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies here at George Washington. So thank you, Sebastian, for hosting us. Thanks to Tom Mayne for his incredible research, which he's going to lay out for you all during his presentation of the report, Turkmenistan, a Model Kleptocracy. And we're also really very pleased to have such a distinguished panel of speakers who are experts on corruption, kleptocracy, and its manifestations in Central Asia. And thank you to all of you who are joining us today. I wanted to provide a little bit of background about Crude Accountability and this project, why we decided to undertake this study, and the backdrop against which this work was done. Crude Accountability, as Sebastian said, is an environmental and human rights NGO, which has been working in the Caspian Sea Basin since 2003. We work with communities, activists, and organizations that have been impacted by oil and gas development, engaging in community-based activism when we can, and researching and documenting the impact of oil and gas development in the Caspian and Black Sea regions. We are also increasingly involved in documenting risks to environmental and land defenders as they face growing threats and violence around the world. Crude has been working on Turkmenistan since the early 2000s and has researched the activity and influence of foreign corporations and international financial institutions in the country, particularly in the oil and gas sector. We have monitored and documented environmental and corporate abuses in the country from a variety of perspectives, including environmental damage, restrictions on civil society and the environmental movement, and the role of international financial institutions in supporting questionable projects in the country. In our research, we have found a tendency of international actors to look the other way, to make allowances, to claim ignorance about environmental impacts, and to ignore egregious human rights violations. Often the excuse is a lack of information. So we've made it our business to try to find that information when we can. It's difficult, and often the story is incomplete, but there is a narrative nonetheless, and it is not a pretty story. You can find our reports on the Crude website if you're interested. Crude is also a founding member of the international Prove They Are Alive campaign, which since 2013 documents the gross and illegal human rights violation of enforced disappearances in Turkmenistan. We have identified and recorded a list of the disappeared, which is periodically updated, and we push for the Turkmen government and international institutions, governments, and intergovernmental bodies to abide by their obligations with regard to human rights. You might ask, why did Crude become part of the Proof campaign? How are these issues connected to one another? And the connections are related to oil and gas revenues, which drive the economy of Turkmenistan, including financing its prison system, and to corruption, disdain for the rule of law, and a complete failure by the leadership to conduct the business of government, that is, to care for its citizens and to think sustainably about their future. This report brings together the issues around corruption related to these and other topics, and it does so in a way that hasn't been done before in one report. So we're really excited to present it. We're eager to engage in discussion and to respond to your comments and questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kate. So now let's move to Tom. Tom, the floor is yours, and we're really looking forward to listening to your presentation on this great report.
Many thanks. Many thanks for hosting to George Washington as well. 15 years ago, I was one of the researchers in a report published by Global Witness called It's a Gas. And this is in some ways a sequel to that report, which was based on a very simple idea the natural resources of Turkmenistan belong to the people of Turkmenistan. So the revenue generated by the sale of these resources also belongs to its citizens. So where is the money? Where does it go? And who is helping to hide it? That's why we concentrate a lot in this report on the Foreign Exchange Reserve Fund, the FERF, which receives the majority of Turkmenistan's gas revenues. It's basically the nexus of the kleptocracy that we see today in Turkmenistan. Now, the big headline of It's a Gas was that President Niyazov controlled a $3 billion fund, the majority of which was held in Deutsche Bank. I think the headline of this report is that, as of 2015 at least, President Berdi Muhammadov controlled a $35 billion fund, the majority of which is still in Deutsche Bank. Now, what's happened to these reserves since then is unclear. We don't know because the IMF and the EBRD no longer publishes data on foreign currency reserves. But let's look at the evidence. Lines lasting for days to buy state-subsidized food, rampant inflation, children begging on the streets, no longer just in the regions, but now in Ashgabat, people going through dumpsters to find anything they can sell or trade. Meanwhile, we have $6 billion spent on the 2017 Martial Arts Games, 2.3 billion spent on a new airport in Ashgabat that nobody uses, 1 billion spent on a tourist zone in Avaza that no one visits. Very much looks like the reserves in the FERF that were 35 billion in 2015 have been frittered away on the president's whims. To put that, these figures in context, in 2019, Turkmenistan received around about $8 billion from China for its gas. So basically, it looks like that Berdi Muhammadov blew a whole year's worth of gas export revenue on the martial arts games and the airport. That's why the FERF, the Foreign Exchange Reserve Fund, is a sovereign wealth fund like no other. Now, make no mistake about it, Azerbaijan is also a kleptocracy. But if you go to the website concerning its wealth fund, SOFAS, you can find information on its management board, its organizational statutes, what it has spent the money on, how much is in there. With the FERF, you have absolutely no information. And I think this lack of transparency is a theme that continues throughout the report. And it truly is staggering. What kind of a government creates a budget and the version that is available to the public is under 2 pages long? What kind of a government doesn't let you know if you have a relative in jail for politically motivated reasons, whether they are even alive or not? What kind of a government says that they've not had a single case of COVID-19? And what kind of a government creates a new Turkmen state oil and gas company, NAPCO, and the only way you can find out who the chairman of this company is when he turns up at an oil and gas conference? Now, with NAPCO, we don't know the shareholding structure. It's ostensibly a state company, but whether there are private shareholders in it, we can't say for sure because of course, the Turkmen government doesn't publish that info. And this is very troubling because I think it marks the beginning of a possible hidden privatization of the Turkmen oil and gas industry. Now, even if the Turkmen government comes out and says, well, actually, it's 100% state-owned company, I don't think that's going to be the end of the story. I was involved in 2013 in another Global Witness report called Azerbaijan Anonymous, which showed how SOCAR, the Azerbaijani state oil and gas company, at the time sold oil to another company called SOCAR Trading, which was not at that time 100% state-owned, allowing private actors to benefit. And it's certainly of interest that SOCAR and NAPCO have said that they may create a joint venture together. So watch this space. Now, as Kate has said, part of the difficulty of researching Turkmenistan is that because it's so secretive, no one knows about the people who control the country. And this is such a contrast to, for example, Kazakhstan. If you know Kazakhstan, everybody knows the names Dadigan Nazarbayeva, Timur Kulibayev, Borat Utamuratov. And I think that's why the work that Bayram, who we'll hear from later, the work that he's doing is so needed, because the deals he's writing about, such as the $2.3 billion expressway built by Berdi Muhammadov's brother-in-law, there's simply no public information about it. You can't just go to a Turkmen government website and expect to find information. And so what I think this report aims to do is to try not to fill any gap we can about what's happening in Turkmenistan with the economy. But I think certainly in chapters 2 and 3, they present a compendium of what's been written about the key companies, such as Bouygues and Itera, Polymex, and also the First Family, put it in one place, and hopefully this will kickstart other investigations, as well as being a repository of information. Now, some of this information is relatively historic, such as the story about how Russian gas company Itera gained a foothold in the early 2000s in the market selling Turkmen gas to Ukraine. But I think it's an important story to retell because A, it's a great example of how business that should be state controlled can get shuffled into private hands. And B, because it also has relevance today because the head of Itera, or Areti as it's called now, Makarov, is still very prominent in Turkmenistan, one of the closest advisors to the president, along with Viktor Khramov, the grey cardinal that used to sit behind Niyazov and continues to sit behind Berdi Muhammadov. The report also marks for the first time, in English at least, that we try to map out the extensive family tree of Berdi Muhammadov. Certainly a work in progress, and even today I've been getting information about the sisters, whether there's 5 or 6, but we need to start identifying these individuals in order to see, for example, whether they hold assets abroad. So in short, we have a country in worse financial shape than under Niyazov, more corrupt, less transparent, probably less accountable. Very much looks like Berdi Muhammadov's son, Serdar, is being groomed for the presidency. So we may have Berdi Muhammadov family rule for the next 30 or 40 years. What is to be done? And that is often the most difficult question. Well, a few ideas from me. Let's stop pretending it's 1994 and we think that Turkmenistan is transitioning to a free market economy as the EBRD still somehow believes. Let's stop pretending that Berdi Muhammadov will open up the onshore gas reserves and just by the mere presence of BP and Exxon, we'll somehow transform this country into some kind of democracy. Let's stop selling military equipment and weapons to Turkmenistan like the UK and Italy does. And let's use the tools we have at our disposal. It's surprising that not a single Turkmen official has been sanctioned under the Global Magnitsky Act. And there are, I think, the EU and UK equivalents coming into, or they have come into force. And so we should definitely look at opportunities there to hold corrupt officials accountable. I think the IMF and the World Bank and the EBRD also need to be stronger about publishing the truth about Turkmenistan. It's a good sign that for the first time, the IMF this year used its own assessment on GDP growth rather than the Turkmen government's bogus figure. But it can go a lot further. Not only does it not publish its Article 4 report, it also doesn't publish a press release. The IMF should publish foreign currency reserve data if it has it. This is information that the Turkmen people have a right to know about. And I think let's continue to write and report about this country to a certain extent, and I wouldn't want to overplay this too much, but the Turkmen government does respond to bad publicity. I'm thinking maybe 10 years ago when ecologist Andrei Zatorka was released from prison after international pressure, when the government closed one of the detention centers after Memorial wrote about the awful conditions there. So we need more of this kind of, in quotes, engagement. I think that's all from me. I want to allow ample time for the Q&A and very much looking forward to hearing the other presentations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom. So now, as I said, we're very lucky to have today 3 great panelists who are going to bring comments and thought about this very important topic. So our first speaker will be Alexander Cooley. Alexander is a Klepto professor of political science at Barnard College, and he's a director of Columbia University's very prestigious Harriman Institute. Alex's research examines how external actors, including emerging powers, international organizations, multinational companies, NGOs, and Western enablers of corruption have influenced the development, governance, and sovereignty of the former Soviet states with a focus on Central Asia and the Caucasus. Alex is also the author or the editor of 7 academic books, including Dictators Without Borders, Power and Money in Central Asia, which was published by Yale University Press in 2017, which he co-authored with John Heathershaw, and most recently, Exit from Hegemony, The Unraveling of the American Global Order, which was published in 2020 by Oxford University Press, and this book is co-authored with Daniel Nexon. So Alex, thank you so much for being with us today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It's just, it's a pleasure and an honor to be here. I think Crude Accountability and Tom, in their respective ways, have been at the forefront of efforts to improve transparency, to conduct first-class investigative work, and to really lift the cover off the mysterious schemes and dealings of countries and the energy sector. And so to see them sort of team up here to produce what I think is the definitive report now on the political economy and the political consequences of Turkmenistan's revenue structures is wonderful. And it's a gift to all of the research and the policy community. I want to use my time to point to what I think the report does that is quite unique and that is quite invaluable, and put it a little bit into sort of a previous context as to why this hasn't been done before. So on the first page of the report, Tom rightly points out that this book that John Heathershaw and I wrote on Dictators Without Borders, that attempted to expose the offshore and extraterritorial connections of Central Asia's elite elites in government, did not have much material on Turkmenistan. He's absolutely right. Turkmenistan's the only country that doesn't get its own chapter, its own kind of symbolic story in the book. And that was to do with the lack of data, so to speak. And the sort of Kate's point about information being the key tool here, right? How, no longer being able to deny that we don't have information about what's going on is absolutely, critical. And I think the big contribution here. So let me lay out a few points here as to why this is a useful tool going forward. First of all, the structure of the report is really clever. We start from the premise of we have these oil and gas funds. They're not very transparent. Here is their legal evolution. Here's the information that we have about them. Where is the missing money, right? And here are some various sort of calculations about the possibilities that we have. In other words, the oil and gas sector's financial dealings is at the core, is at the heart of this analysis, right? From there, we build in sort of two different directions. On the one hand, where do these revenues go outside, right? How can we trace them? And then this leads into some of the investigations, some of the correspondence with Deutsche Bank, which I find, absolutely, fascinating and I think necessary to get them on the record and responding regarding these accounts. Of course, Niyazov's own account with his number appeared to be where a lot of these revenues went. But also, and I think this is the real sort of, significant sort of contribution here, a network of different holdings and dealings that shows a quite globalized structure of intermediaries and holdings, right? When we talk about some of sort of the global connections vis-a-vis, Latvian holdings and banks in Moscow and in industrial groups, German and Berlin-based real estate conglomerates doing their own things, you start seeing a very global picture, actually, of what's going on. And I would say this is sort of my second point, that despite this image that Turkmenistan is autarkic and isolated and kind of this kind of mysterious basket case, it actually has tentacles globally, right? And so what the report does is it shows these kind of global networks where a lot of this money goes out, where a lot of these real estate holdings amongst Turkmen family members and elites are held. And it gives you a sense that Turkmenistan can't do this on its own, right? That the systematic kleptocracy and corruption is tied into all of these Western nodes, bank accounts, accountants, offshore vehicles and companies, advisors, brokers and fixers, foreign industrial conglomerates, right? Whether they be sort of construction companies based in France or groups in Turkey or Denmark or Japan. So what you have is kind of the hidden global side of Turkmenistan laid out in this report. Why hasn't this been done before? It's a function of information, but it's also a function, I think, of the kind of painstaking research that Tom has had to do across multiple open sources, as well as sort of multiple areas of finding his own data. The case I use, I think Kazakhstan's a great telling comparison, right? We all know about the colorful lives of sort of Kazakhstan's elite. Some of them read like sort of spy thrillers, and we have different books by dissidents and journal articles and so forth. But to me, the telling comparison here is not so much Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. Uzbekistan under Karimov was also very autarkic, very secretive, very repressive. But we had a much better picture of the kleptocratic networks because of a series of telecom corruption scandals that erupted that involved Gulnara Karimova, the president's daughter. Once there were international investigations amongst Dutch, Swiss, French, and US authorities into these dealings, then we started to get a much fuller picture of what had happened in Uzbekistan. And in turn, that actually showed a light onto sort of these dealings and schemes and networks and power struggles. We haven't had anything comparable in Turkmenistan, right? We have one FCPA case, the Daimler case, and there's some reference to that, but we haven't had this kind of smoking gun global investigation to shine a light. And so what Tom has done here is he has given us that, right? He has given the sort of global map to what's going on. My final points concerns chapter 3 and 4. Again, I think very clever. So having established, the revenue part and showing sort of the problems of endemic and systemic corruption in Turkmenistan, Tom takes this in two focused directions. One is this family map that he has, filling in the bits of Niyazov, Muhammadaf's family, and you see how globalized they are. You see their personal networks and structures. That's extremely useful. But then 4, I think, is absolutely vital too. We sometimes talk about human rights abuses and political repression as a separate thing from this political economy system. And what Tom shows in his final chapter is that the use of financial crimes, right, to go after elites who are perceived to be disloyal or who turn against the family or act as whistleblowers is itself a consequence of this very corrupt, opaque system, right? Once the system is like this, then you can charge anyone with embezzlement, anyone with financial crimes, right? You can sort of go back and really throw anyone under the bus who appears to be disloyal. And so this system has an important political function too. It provides a wealth of compromat, of potentially chargeable crimes, as well as a way of accessing the investigative powers of overseas regulators to go after political dissidents and insiders who turn against the regime. So for all these reasons, this is a really important document. I hope it'll be used, it'll be debated, as Tom says. I hope it'll be added to, but it's filled what was an enormous gap in our understanding of Turkmenistan and its place in the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alex. Just I would like to remind to our audience, if you want to send your questions, please feel free to write them in the chat box. Now we'll have Cassie Michel. So Cassie is a writer and investigative journalist based in New York. Cassie primarily covers transnational money laundering, illicit finance, foreign interference, and kleptocracy. His writing has appeared in Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, The Atlantic, The New Republic, Political Magazine, and The Washington Post, among others, and is the author of the forthcoming American Kleptocracy, How the US Created the World's Greatest Money Laundering Scheme in History, and is a former Peace Corps volunteer in Kazakhstan. So Cassie, thank you very, very much for being with us today, and the floor is yours.
Of course. Thank you so much, Sebastian. Thank you to Kate for hosting this, and not least of all, thanks to Tom for putting together this fantastic report. I mean, I want to just echo everything that Alex just said as it pertains to how this report fills this what had been previously gap in knowledge about and understanding of how the Turkmen regime relies on this phenomenon that we've begun to describe as kleptocracy. That is to say, transnational financial flows, illicit financial flows that cross those national borders, often and certainly almost always, and certainly in this case, utilizing Western financial secrecy vehicles and Western financial institutions themselves. For years, we have, when we've thought of kleptocracy at all in the post-Soviet space, we have thought of Moscow, we've thought of Baku, we've thought of figures like Viktor Yanukovych out of Ukraine. Maybe if you're a little bit more keyed into this kleptocratic space in Central Asia, you think of figures like Nursultan Nazarbayev and his family, and the reliance on secret Swiss bank accounts, the reliance on prominent Western figures like Tony Blair to whitewash the regime. If you're very keyed into this space, like some of us here today are, maybe you think of figures like Maxim Bakiev, the son of the former Kyrgyz strongman, who again relied on Western shell companies to move millions of dollars out of Kyrgyzstan before uprooting and, as far as we can tell, remaining in London for the past few years. You have a whole range, really a kind of a buffet of options as it pertains to kleptocratic figures and families and oligarchic entities, certainly state-linked entities in the region that you can learn plenty from about how modern kleptocracy operates, about how these dictatorships and authoritarian regimes use and utilize these international financial flows to, as we say, loot, launder, and stash millions and millions of dollars and potentially more, often from state coffers or from state contracts. But again, as Alex said, there has always been one gaping hole in our understanding of Central Asian and frankly post-Soviet kleptocracy itself, and that is Turkmenistan. And that again is what Tom's report fills so remarkably. I mean, it's one thing to put together a report in and of itself to highlight that gap, to highlight that hole, but it's a completely different story to put together the kinds of details, the kinds of numbers, the kinds of findings, and again, this wonderfully comprehensive and wonderfully readable document. And I know it's live now on the Crude Accountability website, and I would highly, highly recommend everybody read through, again, for all the reasons that Alex just laid out. I want to take my time here, at least this opening bit, to run through a few quick points that Tom's paper highlights as it pertains to how the Turkmen regime uses and utilizes similar mechanisms to other kleptocratic cases we have seen in Central Asia. At the end, I'll also touch on one key difference that I noted in the paper that I think might point the potential direction for future research in this space. Again, just to reiterate, thankfully, because of Tom's report, Turkmenistan is a black hole no more. The first primary node of commonality that I wanted to highlight and make sure that everyone is aware of is something that Tom actually mentioned in his opening discussion. That's the role specifically of Western banks in these financial flows. And again, when we talk about kleptocracy, we talk about money looted from national coffers for the benefit often of the regime itself. All these figures that Tom details in the report, these are all figures that should have raised and should continue to raise significant red flags for any Western institution, any Western entity that works with them, especially in the finance space and certainly most especially in the banking space. But as we have seen, as the report lays out, and as we've seen time and again, those red flags, even when they are raised, don't seem to mean much whatsoever. The first and perhaps primary entity that Tom mentioned and is detailed in the report is that of a German bank called Deutsche Bank. But some of you may be familiar with Deutsche Bank from its work on behalf of a certain former American president, a guy named Donald Trump, and the Trump Organization, especially as it pertains to offering Trump large-scale and what remain to be questionable financial loans to bail out his businesses prior to his ascendancy to the presidency. There was a fantastic book that I have right next to me called Dark Towers from a New York Times reporter that detailed the history of Deutsche Bank, that detailed the history of its work with all kinds of unsavory regimes, all kinds of oligarchic and dictatorial figures. there was hardly a single regime, as the book details, that Deutsche Bank didn't seem to work with. It helped evade sanctions for regimes and regime-linked figures in places like Iran, in places like Libya, in places like Sudan, in places like Myanmar, places like Syria. There was one internal Deutsche Bank review that found that, quote, 100 politically exposed clients didn't have requisite documentation showing things like where their money came from. And again, these are high-ranking figures. These are oligarchic figures. These are, in some cases, family members of dictators that were nonetheless able to access Deutsche Bank's services, its own access to other additional Western financial flows, other financial institutions, and again, other laundering industries. I will say what's remarkable, just to reiterate the point once more about the hole that Tom's report fills. This book on Dark Towers, this book on Deutsche Bank is 320 pages long. And I was emailing with the author the other day. The book itself doesn't mention Turkmenistan a single time. The author was not aware of these links that already existed. But lo and behold, the Turkmen regime turned to them time and ago as their primary Western financial partner. Now, we know that relationship is deep. It dates to at least 1995. It's where Turkmenistan's foreign currency reserve is held. And we know that Deutsche Bank has been involved closely with internal investigations in Turkmenistan regarding, again, the millions that have supposedly been stolen from the state. We also know that Deutsche Bank personally serviced at least Niyazov's family. And this is where I want to quote Tom's report specifically. And he wrote, quote, while Niyazov was in power, Deutsche Bank claimed it had never held personal accounts on behalf of Niyazov, a point which was obviously made moot by Niyazov's de facto control over Turkmenistan's state accounts, such as the FERF, which is also held at Deutsche Bank. But Deutsche Bank, again, has never responded to questions sent by anti-corruption campaigners about whether it held accounts for other family members. Maybe it didn't hold an account specifically for Niyazov. Maybe it doesn't hold an account specifically for Berdi Muhammadov. But as we know from any number of other cases, they don't have to be in their names only. You can have friends, you can have family members, you can have other state-linked entities that are perfectly accessible. You know, think back a few years ago to the revelations from the Panama Papers, a very well-known Russian cellist, Sergei Roldugin, who just so happened to be holding hundreds of millions of dollars in his offshore accounts. Oh, and just so happened to be a very close personal friend of Russian President Vladimir Putin. So by all appearances, Deutsche Bank seemed to do as little as possible to make sure it wasn't specifically servicing the Turkmen elite. And I thought there was a great quote in here from Niyazov himself, where he was talking to the former central bank chairman. Niyazov, he kind of puts on these airs, and he says, why have you been carrying out these money transactions in Frankfurt? Why have you been using Deutsche Bank? And the answer seems, frankly, pretty simple. It's because Deutsche Bank would carry out transactions for absolutely anybody, including, as we now know, the Turkmen regime. Now, again, much of this is also on the German financial regulatory oversight body that continued to fail time and again as it pertained to Deutsche Bank. But I don't think it should be any surprise that, as Tom's report highlights, Deutsche Bank played if not the central role in these elite financial flows out of Turkmenistan. So I want to touch on two quick final things. One commonality, that is the role of real estate, specifically American real estate, which Tom's report also touches on. As we've seen time and again, American real estate has been this absolutely wonderful vehicle for any number of regimes to hide and launder their ill-gotten gains. Again, 98% of real estate sales in the U.S., both on the commercial and residential side, are perfectly anonymous. You never need to know who the money is behind it. Some of them can be purchased in cash. Some of them can be purchased with lawyers, providing extra layers of security. As Tom's report highlighted, the Turkmen ambassador to the U.S. purchased millions of dollars worth of American real estate, multiple houses, multiple apartments, apparently even some timberland. I'm sure being an ambassador has its perks, and I'm sure being an ambassador is well compensated. You know, I don't know that it's enough to afford multiple million-dollar homes across the U.S., and that's something we can talk about later. But again, this is another commonality that we have seen across any number of other Central Asian regimes, whether it's Kazakh officials purchasing Trump properties in New York, whether it's Lola Karimova, Gulnara's sister, purchasing multiple mansions in California. This is a pattern that we have seen time and again. Just to highlight what Alex said, these globalized networks, these patterns that have emerged and we've become familiar with certainly elsewhere, are things that the Turkmen elite and regime have tapped into. The commonalities, Western banks, Western real estate. There is one difference that I did want to just touch on momentarily that, again, maybe we can talk about later. And that's a kind of the other phenomenon, the other side of this kleptocratic coin. So much of modern kleptocracy, transnational financial flows, transnational illicit finance for the purpose of making dirty money clean. The other side of that is the phenomenon that we now know as reputation laundering. That is to say, the use of these ill-gotten gains to transform the regime, the elite, the oligarchs, the dictators, the families themselves into these, democratizing figures, into these philanthropists, into these moguls, whatever kind of positive connotation you would like. This takes a number of forms, whether it is hiring PR professionals, large-scale donations to nonprofits and universities, hiring lobbyists themselves to lobby officials in Washington or in London or in Brussels. I mentioned Tony Blair earlier in his role in Kazakhstan, but think of Russian or Ukrainian oligarchs making these large-scale donations, or even the Azeri regime secretly funding congressional junket a few years ago, and you get the idea. One of the things that we didn't see in the report is the Turkmen regime and the Turkmen elite doing this. That is to say, pursuing these kinds of reputation laundering schemes, whether it's the family members themselves, whether it's the oligarchs, and certainly whether it's the regime itself. And there's another book. I have all these piles of books I don't want to highlight today, called Turkmenis Scam, which is it's a very short book about an American journalist a few years ago posing as a broker for none other than the Turkmen regime and going to a number of PR shops and lobbying shops in Washington to try to hire them, and in many cases successfully, to spin Niyazov and now Berdimuhammedov Muhammadaf and their regimes. And the reason that he was able to do so is because there was such a dearth of similar efforts from the Turkmen regime in Washington, in London, in Brussels. And that absence of effort and that dearth of effort is certainly something that I think is worth considering and pursuing as we move forward with further research into the Turkmen kleptocracy. Why is it that they're doing that? What can we learn about similar mechanisms elsewhere, and where may they go from here? So those are the commonalities and the differences I wanted to highlight, and I'll turn it back to Sebastian.
Thank you so much, Kathy. So now let's move to our third speaker, Bayram Shikhmuradov. Berabi is a journalist and analyst and the editor-in-chief of the Good.org website since its foundation in December 2001. In 1995, he graduated from the Turkmen State University with a law degree, and he began working in the international department of the National Olympic Committee of Turkmenistan. Later, Bayram Shikhmuradov was engaged in sports management until leaving Turkmenistan in 2001. And since 2001, he's been on the Good.org website as the author of analytical work on the current political and economic situation in Turkmenistan. And in 2012, he also took up investigative journalism, covering the problem of corruption in the Turkmen government, as well as the use of doping in Turkmen sports. Bayram, thank you very much for being with us today, and the floor is yours.
Good morning, good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for having me here. I will try to be brief. The report, Turkmenistan, a Model Kleptocracy, that we are discussing here now is a very important work, and I really believe it. It is important to understand that we cannot expect any adequate action by countries' authorities themselves. And Turkmenistan really needs help because the corruption in the country is centralized. And it is designed in such a way that every lower level official shares the illegally obtained benefits with the higher level official up to the very top, where we have the president. And as we all know, the main characteristic feature of corruption is conflict of interest, a situation in which the personal interest of an official can influence his decision-making process. And this is how the interests of state and society are being harmed. Corruption literally is the abuse of power for personal gain. They discuss the matter in Turkmenistan now, and Berdimuhammedov Muhammadaf even used the word corruption a few times. And there is an acting law on combating corruption of 2014 in Turkmenistan, and its Article 3 states that that a civil servant should not allow a situation in which the possibility of obtaining benefits for himself or related third parties may affect the proper performance of his official duties. The standard formula that we can find in almost any anti-corruptional legislation in the world. And the statement is actually very clear. A person who receives a salary from the state in his activities must be guided exclusively by the interest of the state and practically exclude any possibility for himself to behave, to act otherwise. And this is exactly what Berdimuhamedov does not do. But he does exactly the opposite. He literally distributes the national treasure among his relatives. While speaking about combating corruption and throwing one minister after another to jail. History, unfortunately, has no example when the corrupt officials fight themselves. So, like, it is obvious that you need an independent law system, a free independent media, controlled by civil society, and other such institutions that simply do not exist in Turkmenistan. So it makes it very important to support the situation in the country from outside, because the country's economy is really struggling. The crisis, my opinion is that the crisis happened as a result, mostly as a result of absolutely illiterate and unprofessional government, because failure happened even in those sectors of the economy where there were absolutely no objective prerequisites for this. For example, against the background of critical food shortage in the country, Berdimuhamedov somehow managed to destroy agriculture. Or we can use an example like his contracts for constructing very expensive factories and plants, spending billions of dollars, while the previously built facilities could not even come close to the plant capacity. And the same situation happens not only in industrial production, but literally all sectors of the economy of Turkmenistan, especially the most current intensive ones, are being controlled by totally unprofessional members of Berdimuhamedov family, like Berdimuhamedovs, Rejepovs, Davletovs, and whoever is there, a dozen other families, which form a hierarchical corruption system, with the help of which President Berdimuhamedov actually destroys the state, driving it into debt and losing the independence that Turkmen are so proud about. In order to fight the current situation, you need to start with releasing as much information as possible. And today we see that investigative journalism is very popular and really in demand all over the world. But I can say that such work is especially important for Turkmenistan. As an example, I can briefly tell you about investigations in which I myself was directly involved. And the first of these notable works was the investigation of the corruption activities of the ambassador of Turkmenistan in the United States, Michel Bayramov, who bought up local real estate in US using the capital that came from nowhere. Then we made a story about the corruption contract for the construction of Ashgabat-Turkmenabad highway, the one for $2.3 billion, which President Berdimuhamedov presented to his brother-in-law, Ananazar Rejepov. And finally, I can say about our recent investigation conducted jointly with the Turkmen News website and OCCRP about how Ananazar Rejepov's son, Haji Murad, who controls the supply of food products to Turkmenistan, is making super profits and spending money for luxurious lifestyle in Ashgabat. I can really like this work really became very important for me, and I can speak about it endlessly, but thank you very much for attention. I will not take any longer now, because it seems to me that it is very important to give the audience an opportunity to ask questions, to which I believe my colleagues and I will be happy to answer. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bayram, for your comments, and I mean, thank you all of you for your thoughts, which really highlight how important this topic is, how unfortunately understudied this topic is. I'm going to give maybe some time to Tom if he wants to answer our colleagues' comments, and maybe I'd like also to add some questions, maybe to launch the discussions. I would like to add some questions about how, I mean, specific US legislations and policies could be used to address the undeniable nature of the Turkmen regime. What can be done internationally to hold Turkmenistani officials accountable? For example, are there individuals who should be sanctioned again under a global Magnitsky Act? Tom already mentioned the Magnitsky Act, but you have also other tools like the UK, which recently began using similar sanctions. So should more countries do the same? Also, the United States recently enacted the Anti-Money Laundering Act 2020, which aimed at combating corruption by identifying shell companies. And you have also a new anti-corruption bill known as the Crude Act, which has recently been reintroduced in Congress. So could either of these be useful in the case of Turkmenistan? So before giving the floor to Tom, I mean, first, everybody, of course, all the panelists are very welcome to answer the questions. And second, please, feel free to all our audience to send your questions in the chat box. Thank you very much. And Tom or any of our panelists is welcome to talk.
Thanks, Sebastian. I'll just say a few words. I think just want to pick up on what Casey was saying about Deutsche Bank. I think, you know, what has been fascinating is just looking at the amount of information that has come out from the FinCEN leak and what that shows about banks in general, but certainly Deutsche Bank as one of the main offenders. You know, it seems to be that banks just basically keep the money flowing while escaping legal responsibility by filing these suspicious activity reports. And in our report, in the new report released today, we do mention a few examples regarding Turkmenis Scam. But they could, you know, refuse the transaction, close the account, but this is not what Deutsche Bank does. It keeps the money flowing, receiving, of course, banking fees. Meanwhile, we have a FinCEN in the US and the UK equivalent, the National Crime Agency, totally overburdened by these, I think it's 500,000 in the UK, millions in the US, these suspicious activity reports that the enforcement agencies can't really look at. And, you know, when you have something which maybe has the Turkmen government's name on it, you're perhaps less likely to ignore all that one, and thus the transfer of capital out of Turkmenistan continues. The example we use in the report is that I think a contract of over $1 million was transferred to a Scottish limited partnership, which is a very opaque structure often used by money launderers. And this transaction was supposedly for confectionery. It was transferred to a Latvian bank, $1 million signed off by a Turkmen ministry. That surely is a transaction that should not be allowed. But even though Deutsche Bank flagged it as suspicious, the money was allowed to continue. So we have a real problem there in not just the banks holding these accounts, but these banks failing to stop illicit transactions. Sebastian, on your question on what can we do, you mentioned some some new legislative messages there. Obviously, we've got some old ones like the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act that has been used in more recent years with Gulnara Karimova, I think, and years ago with the Kazakh case. I think these absolutely should be used on Turkmenistan, but the difficulty we have is perhaps the lack of information on certain individuals. When we're talking about Global Magnitsky, you know, you need evidence of corruption. Now, we might have it with the US ambassador to, sorry, the Turkmen ambassador to the United States. It's unclear whether they would sanction an ambassador who's resident in the country. That's an open question. But the main problem, I think, with Turkmenistan is who, other than the president, really has the power. We could speak about Shikhmuradov. We could speak about Serdar, of course, the son. But when we're looking at Magnitsky, we're told that maybe, you know, they won't sanction, obviously, the head of state. We're looking at the kind of middle-ranked manager, but there aren't really many middle-ranked managers with any power in Turkmenistan, and there was perhaps a concern that if they were put on the Magnitsky list, they would just be thrown in jail in Turkmenistan, and the guys at the top would escape scot-free. So I think it is work that needs to be done, but there is questions over with the requirements of what kind of information you need to submit regarding Magnitsky sanctions, whether this information is even there on Turkmen officials. But undoubtedly, there should be some submissions made, and officials should be sanctioned. It's just about identifying who they are.
Well,
yes.
Thank you, Tom. Maybe just before giving the floor to our other panelists, I mean, just to go on this question, because I mean, we talk a lot about the corruption of Turkmenistani elites, of Berdi Muhammadaf, which is kind of obvious, but at the same time, what can be done to hold to account foreign companies which work in Turkmenistan and who may be complicit, I mean, in this corrupt system? And you mentioned that very clearly. I'm thinking, for example, about the French company Bouygues. So in the Turkmenistan state context, would there be some possible initiatives to make foreign companies more accountable? Could or should other countries use something similar, for example, to the US Corrupt Practices Act?
I think that there should, undoubtedly be investigations into the companies operating in Turkmenistan. I think that probably once you start delving beneath the surface, so many stories. Companies like to argue that, just as I say, their mere presence in the country increases transparency, creates jobs, good accounting practices, and all that. We actually have an example in the report that really refutes that. An unnamed company, oil and gas company, services company, I think, was in Turkmenistan, and because of the way Turkmenistan is, it wasn't getting paid. The country manager was basically cooking the books to make it look like they were doing far more drilling than they actually were. So it's very easy for companies to get co-opted into the system of corruption in Turkmenistan. We have, for example, in the UK Bribery Act has been going for 10 years now, but we've not really seen it being enforced in relation to the bribery of foreign officials. Very few prosecutions, and all the prosecutions, at least in the UK under this particular act, are to do with people bribing to get a driver's license in the UK. This is not what we were presented with when the UK Bribery Act was brought in. We were told it was going to be transformational about trying to counteract bribery abroad and foreign corruption, but we've just not seen it happen. The UK certainly is very good at talking the talk, bringing in new legislation, but not really enforcing it. And I think it has a bit of certainly a weak spot when it is in regard to companies involved in these kleptocracies. I think in America, I think Biden is talking the talk, obviously much more than his predecessor, about the importance of tackling grand corruption and kleptocracy. Whether it will filter through to the Department of Justice, and we'll see the kind of renewal of the kind of investigations that we're famous for regarding Kazakh, regarding Karimova, remains to be seen. But I very much hope that this does happen.
Thank you, Tom. Maybe I'll give a chance to our other panelists to respond. I mean, to your comments and to the questions. I mean, Kate, Alex, Casey, Bayram, would you like to say anything?
Yes, I want to say, and it is very important to say it in the beginning of the discussion, as I believe, that we must all understand that the situation in Turkmenistan is very, very different from what we have in other parts of the world or in other countries. This is like totally different level, you know, even if comparing to, let's say, one of the most well-known cases, like Magnitsky case in Russia. Like Magnitsky case could never happen in Turkmenistan because such person, even if he existed, he would have been killed on a much earlier stage of his activities than it really happened in Russia. So Magnitsky case in Russia could never happen if Magnitsky's lawyer did not have access to the prison, to the jail. So this is what happens in Turkmenistan. And if we look for an example, so like, you know, when they say when you are on the street, you are being attacked by a number of people, and you definitely cannot fight them all, and you are cornered, and you have nothing left to do. So the only chance for you is to choose just one of them and to start executing him in the most violent and cruel way possible, bloody, like to demonstrate your readiness to not to stop. And in most cases, it frightens your opponents. This is what Berdimuhamedov does. This is what Niyazov did. This is what Berdimuhamedov does. His reaction to whatever questions, whatever actions coming from outside of Turkmenistan, his reaction is so inadequate that there is no understanding of how to deal with it. There is no mechanism to deal with it. This is a big problem for United Nations, for UN. This is a very big problem for OSCE. This is a very big problem even for the European Union. They don't know what to do with this person who behaves so not adequate that everybody just, you know, everybody's shocked like what they see, and he uses the situation. And you see, I'm doing investigations. Yeah, I'm doing investigation journalism, and I practically see that there is the lack of information that we have there. We cannot even call it lack. Like there is no information, absolutely. You know, even official statistics are not published. Yeah, you say Tom used like the Turkmenistan, the Model Kleptocracy report uses the number of 5 million people population of Turkmenistan. Like who knows what population of Turkmenistan is? You cannot say it is 5 million because like nobody knows. If it is 5 million or 8 million or 2 million, nobody knows. Even official statistics are not published. Like official documents are not available. We have access to a few databases of Turkmenistan government, but documents there are not full. Like they just erase whatever numbers are there, like amounts, dates, names of companies, names of individuals. So it is like official. So the documents are being archived in Turkmenistan, edited as much as possible. The same way like they edit president's photos on their newspapers, like they make him look good and whatever. So whoever wants to do something with Turkmenistan, how to bring these people to justice, like we have to find some other mechanisms, not those mechanisms that are being used in the civilized world. Something needs to be done, and my suggestion is that it is obviously necessary to review the attitude of the intergovernmental organizations, because now the situation is that UN leaves to national governments the prerogative to dispute, to sanction, or to press on Turkmenistan government in this situation, while UN itself is totally absolutely neutral. Like they're being present in the country, and they are so loyal that that it's that it makes it like impossible to follow their activities there. So whatever they do, it is like absolute nonsense. They totally ignore the resolutions of the General Assembly in regards of the human rights in Turkmenistan, but they celebrate like every day for them is some holiday. They celebrate everything, all these stupid initiatives of Turkmenistan government. They celebrate every day. They celebrate. They don't care about human rights. They don't care about the economy, and like they actually don't do anything. So it is very important that UN should review its attitude and review its mechanisms, which they tried to use in Turkmenistan some time ago, but now they like totally forgot about it and nobody cares there.
Thank you, Bayram. Alex, Kate, Cassie, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, just quickly, I think this point about statistics is a really important one, right? That you've seen just sort of a caricature of the mangling and purposeful falsification, obfuscation of official statistics, and you see the direct equation of how information really is power in the public sphere, something that was mentioned at the outset but has been brought into sharp relief by COVID, right? And the hiding of public health data to the complete denialism that there's COVID in Turkmenistan, the point that this had to be reported on from outside. So we have this place where this space where really information is power, and the publication of truthful information is something that can't happen. And this is why I think Tom's point on the IFIs is so critical, right? Yes, there are certain considerations that IFIs might have in terms of reporting data, and could certainly report on certain methodological and statistical discrepancies and so forth. But if the IMF and the World Bank want to be in the business of being in Turkmenistan, of reporting on what goes on there, then they absolutely have to insist on minimal reporting and verification requirements, right? Otherwise, just don't be there, right? This has to be just a very basic level of understanding in terms of what they're going to get themselves into. And I think what you've seen both with the IFIs, and I think my other example of this would be election monitoring, this willingness to sort of compromise on these bodies' own standards and meet the Turkmen government, I won't even say halfway, I would say sort of 80% on their terms, really does a discredit, I think, to these organizations' own reputation as sort of the gold standard providers of economic data. So this is a problem that's far more pervasive, and I think Tom hinted at it, as well as Boris in his excellent comments.
Yes,
Sebastian, just to jump into to turn back to your question about what can be done, what should be done, what should we be pushing for. I mean, there's nothing atypical within what we've learned in Tom's report about how the Turkmen regime and the kleptocracy operates. There's nothing atypical in terms of solutions, right? It reinforces that much more this kind of basket of solutions, of these kind of counter kleptocracy programs and pieces of legislation we should be encouraging, and that's ending anonymity in shell companies in real estate, or shell companies in trust, ending anonymity in real estate, ending anonymity anonymity in hedge funds and private equity, ending anonymity in things like art and auction house purchases, while in places like Washington, as you mentioned, Sebastian, pushing counter kleptocracy legislation. These are things like the Crook Act, which is a piece of legislation that I believe was recently introduced in Washington, which would take a slice of FCPA-related fines and specifically dedicate them toward good governance reforms, anti-corruption reforms, pro-transparency reforms in countries that are undergoing democratic transitions. These are things like the Foreign Extortion Prevention Act, which is the complement of the FCPA, which would specifically criminalize foreign officials demanding bribes of, in this case, American figures and companies themselves. Again, there's nothing atypical about the solutions as it pertains to restraining the Turkmen regime, restraining these illicit financial flows we've seen out of Turkmenistan. But again, so much of that is it's not just the regulatory apparatus itself. It's not just the oversight itself. It's the enforcement. It is the enforcement of these statutes that are already on the books and statutes that are yet to come. I mean, again, regulations are great, but they are nothing without enforcement. And I know, Sebastian, you mentioned, you questioned whether or not something like the extension of FCP-related statutes into other jurisdictions is something we should be pushing for. And absolutely, it's something we should be pushing for. I mean, I think it was through the late 90s to the early 2000s that foreign bribery was a tax write-off in countries like France and Germany until the U.S. really began pushing for similar legislation elsewhere. But even in countries where we've already seen that, and I'm thinking of places like, traditionally good government jurisdictions like Sweden, the willingness to enforce these FCP-related pieces of legislation are almost null and void. Sweden has only seen 2 successful prosecutions of anti-foreign bribery legislation, as we know from the Gulnara Karimova case. Swedish telecoms were very intimately involved in these transnational illicit financial flows, much of which obviously stemmed from bribery. So, anyways, all of which is to say, this report reinforces that basket of counter kleptocracy legislation and regulations that need to be passed, but yet again reinforcing that those regulations are nothing without enforcement, without resources, without staffing. And again, if nothing else, let this report serve that much further evidence for why those pieces of reform are needed now more than ever.
Thank you so much, Casey. Kate, do you want to add anything?
Yes, just very, very briefly on 2 points. First, I wanted to follow up on Casey's excellent point about the omission in the Turkmen case of reputation laundering. But I think there's one sort of minor exception to that, which gets us back to what this discussion has been about, which is these international financial institutions and membership in intergovernmental organizations like the UN, like the OSCE. And Turkmenistan very much wants to be part of these institutions. They want to participate in the UN. They want to be at the OSCE meetings. They want to go to the HDIM, for example. And that's a very unsophisticated, perhaps, compared to many of these other countries, but it is a type of reputation laundering where they can say, we're part of these international organizations, we're part of this community, and even more so in the IFI community. And let's not forget sort of the basic 101 thing about the IFIs, right? Which is that this is public money. The EBRD, the World Bank, these are institutions that are using taxpayer dollars to finance the projects that they finance. And so transparency, environmental and economic and social standards, these are not just sort of, kind of like fun things that get tacked on. These are essential elements of participating in those institutions and in these economic arrangements that are part of what happens when you get money from the IFIs. And so for the IMF, the World Bank, the EBRD to sort of be accepting the lack of information or the false information that comes from Turkmenistan and kind of check that box rather than really using the only tool and instrument that they have to hold them accountable is another example, I think, of this sort of egregious international failure to hold the country accountable and to then allow for an absence of the type of information that would enable us to use the mechanisms that Alex and Casey and Tom are talking about.
Thank you, Kate. We have about 15 minutes left, so let me take some questions from the audience. And we have one question, maybe just to bring kleptocracy in the to understand the local context actually in Turkmenistan. And the question is, in this country, to what extent is wealth tied to ethnicity and tribal structures? Who wants to answer?
Well, I think we know that in Turkmenistan, the Berabi Muhammadaf's clan, and Bayram, you perhaps know more about this than I do, totally dominates and has since Niyazov's era, and it's perhaps become even more refined just onto this particular group of Berabi Muhammadaf. It used to be that, you know, the Yomuds would control the oil. All that's gone now. It's basically just Berabi Muhammadaf's tribe. So it's very much centered around those kind of power structures and the tribal clan identities.
And another question, probably for you, Tom, also is kleptocracy and sultanism generally go hand in hand. Did you look at kleptocracy through the lens of sultanism in your report?
Well, a part of it is, you know, a lot of these terms are very hard to, you know, define, and I think we do quite a good job at you know, defining what kleptocracy is. But I mean, in some ways, you could call it sultanism. It's because of the nature of Central Asia. I think, you know, from my point of view, what I'm most interested in is the outflow of money from the country to the West, and how that is enabled by Western financial services. And so I think that is why we chose this particular frame of reference.
Okay, thank you. I mean, maybe a question now for all panelists. I mean, could you talk about the pluses and minuses of two different approaches? On the one hand, refusing economic cooperation with such a corrupt president and government, which could have an unintended negative consequence on the general population, versus, on the other hand, cooperating with the government on economic projects where the profits from that cooperation may benefit officials and not the general populations.
Yeah, can I say something like the population in Turkmenistan do not benefit from anything, absolutely. And whatever happens, whatever government connections are there, like, it has absolutely no effect on the quality of people's lives and their income or anything. And it is very important to sanction the regime because they this is actually the only way that can make them react and make them answer questions that are coming from outside. And we see on the example of the interim agreement with the European Union that it actually works. And it is very important that this situation is still there, and the European Parliament still does not accept the signing of the agreement without any improvement in the situation with the human rights. And this is actually what keeps the dialogue open. Otherwise, there would be like absolutely no chance even to discuss the matter with Turkmenistan government. So yes, it is very important to sanction the Turkmenistan regime.
Anyone else? Yeah, Alex, go ahead.
Yeah, just a couple of comments. One is just on the evolution of what you see as this political economy model in Turkmenistan. In the 1990s, you know, whatever Niyazov's personal eccentricities, I think there was this working model that Turkmenistan could manage the transition by not transitioning, just becoming what's known in the literature as a rentier state. That is, it could just collect revenues from the sale of hydrocarbon resources, and it would buy political legitimacy and compliance from a population by subsidizing certain club and public goods. Utilities were the most sort of often cited ones, but also retaining subsidies on some basic foodstuffs. The nature of that bargain's been fundamentally broken over the past years. And so what you see is that Turkmenistan has like failed in its quest to be a rentier state too, right? It's so predatory that it actually can't set aside revenues for like the minimum provision of funds necessary for some, you know, public goods. And so the public bargain, the nature of what it rests on, really is now premised upon, you know, coercion, intimidation, and not wanting to put a foot wrong if you're in the public service, as opposed to kind of a political economy bargain that might have been the case before. And very simply on the question involved, I absolutely agree that organizations like the EU, like the IFIs, have real leverage when dealing with Turkmenistan, more than they think, and that this kind of engagement versus non-engagement argument is rather silly and shallow. The question is on what terms and what sequences. But I would say the more vulnerable actors here are the Western companies themselves, right? Maybe we can't move Turkmen officials in terms of how the system is set up, but the vulnerable parties are Western companies, Western banks, Western service providers that themselves have shareholders, are concerned about the kind of financial press that they receive and their own reputations. And so I think these are absolutely legitimate targets for advocates to concentrate their naming and shaming and firepower on, because they do have to be responsive in certain ways, which offers levers that going after the government or certain ministries themselves does not.
You know, it is also very interesting, like Turkmenistan as a state is built as what I call like a fuel pump with a banquet hall for rent. This is actually what they do. Like exhibitions, competitions, conferences, guests, like concerts, and all that is being funded by money that is coming from selling their natural resources. But now, since like 2 or 3 years ago, the situation has significantly changed. Now, everybody is talking about low carbon power, and more than that, now all this fun activity, like all these conferences, meetings, it all went online. So now there is like Turkmenistan has nothing left to do. Like low carbon power, no meetings. Avaza is empty. They built like enormous number of hotels in Ashgabat, and even 3, 4, 5 years ago, when there was no pandemic and like the borders were open, even at that time all hotels were empty. So now it is very obvious that nobody would come there. Okay, they have the world championship, the cycling world championship, but okay, how many people will come? Like 100, 150 officials, and that's it. So the reason for Turkmenistan existence as a state is slowly like dissolving. They have nothing left to do, and this is what makes Berdimuhamedov act more and more hysterically to gain as much as possible for himself and for his family.
Thank you. I saw Cassie. Yeah, you wanted to add something.
Yeah, just to jump in really quick, two quick points. One, building off of Alex's point about exposure of some of these IFIs and Western financial organizations. You know, the U.S. Department of Justice has shown a very clear willingness over the last 4, 5, 6, 7 years to levy significant money laundering related fines on especially non-American, especially European banks, and that includes institutes like Deutsche Bank. Now, I don't believe that any of the fines thus far demanded by the U.S. Department of Justice on Deutsche Bank, which again have run, there was a $125 million fine Deutsche Bank paid just a few months ago. I don't believe any of that's been related to any kind of Turkmen clientele that they have hired, but there's no reason that to think that that cannot continue as a potential pressure point moving forward, whether it's on Deutsche Bank in particular or any of these comparable banks or financial institutes themselves. And just on the sanction, Bayram mentioned the efficacy and the utility of sanctions moving forward. I believe there's only been 2 Central Asian nationals listed under the global Magnitsky sanctions regime. That's Gulnara Karimov and then Matraimov out of Kyrgyzstan. Again, no Turkmen nationals have been sanctioned. One of the I suppose interesting developments that we've seen play out in the last few months is not in Turkmenistan specifically, but actually in Russia, regarding the list that Alexei Navalny's team has put together, these 35 Russian nationals, including some who are deeply embedded in Western polities, including in places like London, and the efforts at the Navalny team, as Navalny remains in prison, to get Western jurisdictions to specifically sanction, including the U.S., sanction some of these figures. Whether that turns out to be something that's effective or not, we will see. It's certainly something worth keeping in mind moving forward as a potential case study for, again, those pressure points about how Turkmen civil society, other related activists, journalists can use potential leverage moving forward to get the regime itself to change, frankly, any kind of its behavior. We'll see how effective that is moving forward, but it is just, I don't know, on both hands, simultaneous. It's like Schrodinger's sanctions. It's surprising and not surprising that the U.S. has not used global Magnitsky at all in Turkmenistan, and I guess we'll see where we go moving forward.
Thank you, Kese. Next question. In Turkmenistan, information is so tightly controlled, and so there is no or very limited investigative journalism in the country aimed at unveiling corruption. So the question is, do you think that the average citizen of Turkmenistan is aware of the extent of government corruption, including up to the president and his family?
This is the phenomenon of submissive culture. Population of Turkmenistan, citizens of Turkmenistan, they do not consider the central government as something that they could control, and that's why they are totally, I'm sure that they are totally aware of what is happening, but the culture code that is in them do not that's why they do not act, and they will never act. They will not do anything, whatever happens. This is very, very deep in these people. This is not bad, not good. So this is what it is.
Okay, thank you, Bayram. Well, unfortunately, we're very close to the end of this event, but maybe let me ask a last question to try to look a little bit at the future of Turkmenistan and try to look a little bit in an optimistic way. The extremely authoritarian and kleptocratic regime in Turkmenistan is unfortunately not the only one in the world, but in history, we have seen a number of these regimes fall. So how sustainable do you think the Turkmen regime is? Do you consider that the system could go as it is for many years? And another question actually is, even if Berdimuhamed Muhammadaf were to be overthrown, even with a change of power, it's not certain that Berdimuhamed Muhammadaf's regime would be replaced by another, would not be replaced, by another kleptocratic and authoritarian regime. We've seen that in many countries around the world, and in Turkmenistan. As you know, the coming of power of Berdimuhamed Muhammadaf after Nazaf didn't change anything. So thinking about the future, what would be the essential elements which would enable Turkmenistan evolve from a kleptocratic regime to a more accountable regime?
Should I take this one first?
Sure, Tom, sure.
not an expert on this topic, but it seems that Bayram Shikhmuradov has a pretty good handle on the internal security of the country, and it seems like his family could, rule, as I say, for the next 30 years. But we must always remember, as Ahmet Çelik, the Turkish businessman, once said, it's the guys with the guns with the power. So it's not inconceivable that in some decade ahead that the family is replaced. But as you've pointed out, that doesn't necessarily mean any pathway to democracy. When Akayev was replaced in the Kyrgyz Republic with Bakiyev was even more rampantly corrupt, with his son Maxim trying to take over the whole of the Kyrgyz economy. So it's a very, I think, unsure path ahead. Would we ever get to the stage where the country is in just such dire straits in terms of the economy? People come out onto the street, or there's some kind of change. It seems less likely in Turkmenistan than in other countries. As Bayram said, the Turkmen people don't have that same capability of rising up like we've seen in other places, and those situations can often end very badly. So unfortunately, I can't really see any way to a more open society.
Thank you, Tom. I mean, we're late already, but I still would like to give a chance to our other panelists to either answer this question or either bring final thoughts on this event. So, who wants to go first?
I'll just jump in briefly. I am not going to make any predictions, and I certainly hesitate to make any predictions, whether it's on Turkmenistan or any other countries in the region, or frankly on anything these days. Certainly the way the last few years have gone. One of the easiest means of, again, restraining this Turkmen kleptocracy, of restraining this elite predation, and beginning to unwind some of these transnational illicit financial networks that are obviously, again, for the benefit of the regime, of the elite, of the oligarchic caste around Bayram Shikhmuradov, and then obviously about the president himself, are what we discussed earlier, this basket of very clearly necessary, very clearly overdue reforms in Western polities and Western jurisdictions. And these are, again, the things like ending anonymous shell companies and trusts, ending anonymous real estate, ending anonymous purchases in art and auction houses for any number of reasons, whether it's sanctions evasions, whether it's basic, ability for civil society to track financial flows, or what have you. Those areas are within Western jurisdictions' risk. That is to say, those are areas that would be a far lower lift for Western governments and for Western policymakers to implement than implementing the necessary kinds of civil society and basic democratic reforms in Ashgabat itself. So if there's one area to turn energy toward, I certainly kind of flog this horse as much as I can. It is passing these kinds of necessary regulations, passing these kinds of necessary legislation, to begin winding back and undercutting and restraining some of these kleptocratic regimes, kleptocratic flows that we've seen time and again, not only in Ashgabat, but elsewhere through the region itself, and frankly around the world at this point. So that's probably an unsatisfactory answer, but that's the horse I'm sticking to right now.
Thank you, Casey. Alex, do you want to add anything?
I think the proverb is things are stable until they're not, right? And this expectation that somehow the whole system reproduces itself, that's the odds-on type of bet. But we have seen the possibility of punctuated change in the region. And so I think the dimension that we didn't talk about today, that the external dimension that's also in the report that just deserves a mention, is China's partnership in all this, and what leverage and what impact China can have on Turkmenistan's future. For the most part, China has found it very easy to deal with this government, as well as effectively bankroll them when IFIs wouldn't in the midst of the financial crisis, right? So China has provided substitute emergency financing through its Gas for Loans program for the country going forward. So, my sense is there is a a type of built-in kind of, patronage-based sector. There is a sort of a culture of security services, of information flows, and so forth. But that doesn't mean that everything becomes sort of ossified, and that this is a region where demonstration effects are particularly relevant, right? So don't discount, the ability to sort of change in sort of neighboring countries, or kinds of regional geopolitical types of developments, to also shake loose what goes on. So, I think we need to be really careful in distinguishing between projecting sort of stability as an excuse to not do anything, versus, doing it because we have some sort of basis for real analysis.
Thank you, Alex. Kate?
Yeah, I think the main points have really been made quite articulately by my colleagues, but I would just really underscore the point I think we made in the beginning, which is that Turkmenistan, as isolated as it is, does not exist in a vacuum. And what the levers that we have outside of the country for accountability and all of the mechanisms that have been mentioned, Casey just gave a really good list of them, is a place where there is potential for movement, and we never know what's possible and how change might happen. We've been surprised over and over again in history by what happens, and sometimes that's a good thing, and sometimes it's not. So.
Thank you, Kate. Last but not least, Bayram, would you like to add anything? No, I don't. No? You're muted, Bayram.
Yes, sorry. It is very, very important to reveal the information about Turkmenistan, to distribute the information about Turkmenistan. I said it once, and I will repeat it as many times as I can, because this is actually the most important thing today. Unfortunately, we cannot get directly involved into what is happening in Turkmenistan because of lack of civil society institutions and lack of legislation that supports such activities. We cannot be present there. So we have to act from outside. And we see that the regime gives us feedback on what we do. Unfortunately, I have to admit that sometimes it may not, whatever is happening outside of Turkmenistan, when we speak about like sanctions or some other like limitations that can be imposed, it may not be very popular among Turkmenistan people. But this is how the state was built, and actually against people's whatever system exists now, it was built against people's will, and in order to destroy the system, and to bring something new and something more effective and more modern. You have to understand that there will be like tough times, but I hope that it will not take long, and one of the most important factors today is the current economic situation, which will not let the regime last for long. Something will definitely happen in Turkmenistan very soon, and it will be very hard for people to survive, but they will survive, and the situation will definitely change, because it cannot continue like it is now, like it is continue, like whatever is happening now, it cannot continue for a long time.
Thank you so much. I mean, I'm really sorry, but we really need to conclude. We're late. So I would like to thank again Tom, Kate, and Crude Accountability for this very important report. I would also like to thank all our panelists today. So Alex, Kate, and Bayram for their comments and this extremely interesting discussion. I would like to thank all of our audience who sent questions that were with us during all this event. So I would also like to add that I very strongly recommend to download and read this report, which is available on Crude Accountability website. So thank you all of you for being with us today, and we look forward to having you in another GW IRIS event. Thank you very much. Have a good day, have a good afternoon, or have a good evening. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you very much.